Mai te pua, mai te tawato, mai te ka ui riki. Mai e tā ui rongo, a ti ei mauri ora. He tū tēnei mana whenua tūpoko o tika taranaki iwi. Tati awa ki te mei atu ki a koutou. Nau mai, ara mai, piki mai, kake mai. Koutou mai, tata mai, tāwhiti, whakatau mai. Ki a koe te minita, ngā mei ki a koe. He tino wā tēnei mo Aotearoa. I te wā i timata i te ao e ai ki ngai Māori, wā i ana. A papa rāua ko rangi. Nā tērā i poku reri, aerea tāwiri mā te wepungia te ao i ngā marangai me ta au. Ka pērā tonu i tēnei wā i Aotearoa nei, koe rā te take. He tino wānanga tēnei mō koutou mō Aotearoa nui tonu, no reira nau mai, ara mai, piki mai, kake mai, whakatau mai. According to Māori legend, when Papa, the Earth Mother, and Ranginui were separated, it caused the god of weather events, Tāwhiti Mātea, to lash the world with storms. And it appears that Tāwhiti is still incredibly angry about that separation as we've experienced this year. They say in comedy that timing is essential, and the timing of this conference is well placed given the weather that we've experienced over the first 2 months of the year. Although I would suggest that members of the Green Party and perhaps all New Zealanders looking at this are saying that perhaps this conference should have happened 10, 15 years earlier. But we're here now and we have the brightest people within New Zealand in the agricultural and climate change sectors. So hopefully something good will come out of this for agriculturalists and New Zealanders across the board. So nau mai, hara mai, piki mai, kake mai, whakatau mai, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa. If I could all ask you to be upstanding, and we'll finish off with an echo waiata. If I start and you echo, we'll get there. E toru ngā mea, ngā mea nunui, e ki ana, te pai pera, whakapono, tūmana ko, ko te menui, ko te aroha. Don't you wish solving the issues around climate change were as easy as following that, singing that waita? Mā te runga rawa koutou tātou e mana ki e tiaki. Ki runga ki raro ki wao ki roto, di au pai mārere. Kia ora everyone, have a wonderful conference. And I'll hand you over to your MC, Steve Thompson. Kia ora. Thanks.
Kia ora, Peter. Thank you very much. That was Peter Jackson, the representative of Taranaki iwi Kalmātua, who welcomed us on behalf of Te Papa and the iwi. My name's Ngā mihi o te ata. My name's Steve Thompson. I'm chair of the New Zealand Agricultural Gases Research Centre. The last time we met in this room, I think, was a couple of years ago, and we haven't really had a chance to meet since then. I would like to welcome you here on behalf of the Ministry of Primary Industries and the centre itself. I'm delighted to see you here again in Wellington. It's now time to launch into our morning speakers, and I want to draw your attention. I want to draw your attention to two things first. One is to a note about one of our illustrious board members who sadly died this year, Mike Harvey of Niwa. He was one of our advisory group members who sadly died, and we greatly miss his wisdom and expertise from the governance group. I also want to draw your attention if it works for you, because it doesn't work for me, to our conference app, which is where we were apparently trying to run live questions. I don't know if yours works, but mine is packed up. So if it doesn't, we have a roving microphone, and all you have to do is wave wildly at me when I'm not wearing my glasses, and I will catch you. So there will be questions after each speaker, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. It's a pleasure to see you back here, James. We had thought that you might have to make a recorded presentation because you've been so busy recently. I think James is well known to all of us. He could have been making a lucrative career as a management consultant, and in 2006 he changed his mind and he went back and he got himself a graduate degree in sustainable development. And James, I was a professor of sustainable development once, so congratulations on that degree. And he came back to New Zealand. He joined Parliament in 2014. And he has been Minister for Climate Change in recent years. He's seen the Zero Carbon Act through Parliament. He's reformed the emissions trading scheme. He established Green Investment Finance Limited. And he's really had, over the last few years, James, what I think must be the most frustrating job. And in particular, in the events of the last few days have made that even more frustrating. So we look forward to hearing from you on the ways forward for a country of New Zealand's size and positioning in the world. James Shaw.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. Remind me never to talk to you about sustainable development, Professor. Before I begin, I do just want to start by acknowledging all of those of you who are in the audience who have either been directly or indirectly affected by Cyclone Gabrielle in particular, or by the Auckland and Northland floods 2 weeks before that. I know that there are people in the room who will have been directly involved, and that you'll have homes or family or farms or businesses that have been severely damaged as a result of the cyclone or the floods, or perhaps both of those things. But I also know that there are people in the room who will be affected because your families have been affected as well. I know there are colleagues of mine who, for example, had to ring emergency services to arrange the helicopter to get their parents off the roof, and others who didn't hear for a week because the telecommunications were out of joint, to find to some relief actually that their family were okay. But obviously there's a lot of stress and worry there in the meantime until the telecommunications are back online. So I do know that people will be feeling it right now. And of course our top priority in the immediate future has to be on ensuring that all of those who are affected have what they need to be able to kind of start the recovery. The theme that I was given to talk to is about agriculture in the time of consequences. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what I'm hearing about should we continue to try and cut our emissions, or should we put all our efforts into adaptation. Talk a little bit about what I know about what's going on internationally, and third, about what New Zealand's role is in that effort. I know you've heard me talk about many of these things before, but there is a sort of a slightly different light to it this year, which we'll be treating this year's conference in. I also want to pass on the apologies of the Prime Minister, for whom I am standing in. Obviously, well, I actually think the invitation was agreed to by a previous Prime Minister, and also the current Prime Minister has had a few things on in the 5 weeks that he's been the Prime Minister. So the first thing, like I said, that I wanted to talk to you about was some of this question around the balance between continuing to focus on trying to cut the pollution into the atmosphere that causes climate change in the first place versus adapting to the effects of climate change. And I want to preface it by saying that adaptation policy in this country has been the poor cousin of mitigation policy, and we haven't done that great on mitigation policy, so adaptation policy is really dragging the chain. There is some interest in it now, however, so if there's a silver lining to come out of events of recent weeks, it will be that it does seem that the system is starting to wake up to the idea that we need to deal with it. Even before Cyclone Gabrielle, 6 out of the 14 regions of this country were in a state of disaster recovery. Let's just think about that. So before Cyclone Gabrielle, just shy of half of the country was in a state of disaster recovery. All of those disaster recovery efforts were related to weather-related events. 2 of those 6 regions were in a regional state of emergency, that's Auckland and Northland, due to the flooding events that had occurred up there. In other words, we had not finished dealing with the last set of climate-related disasters before the next one hit. The recovery from Cyclone Gabrielle will take years, and in the meantime, there will be more storms, more floods, droughts, and so on. In other words, we will not have finished cleaning up and recovering from Cyclone Gabrielle when we move into the recovery mode of the next set of storms either. And in fact, we've just seen that in the last 24 hours with people being in Gisborne and Tairāwhiti being evacuated due to flooding from rain events there over the course of the last 24 hours. So, this is the kind of compounding nature of the climate crisis. And I know that one of the things that I have heard a lot over the course of the last month is it's just another storm. We've had cyclones before, we've had rains before, we've had floods before. This is nothing particularly, yes, it's bad, but it's nothing particularly unusual. And whilst it is true that weather has existed prior to this point in human history, the frequency and the severity of these events, we can say with an extremely high degree of scientific confidence, is worse as a result of climate change. I don't have the numbers for Cyclone Gabrielle yet. It's attribution science, my understanding, is more complex with cyclones than it is with rain events. But the Auckland and Northland floods, I am told, we can say with a high degree of confidence, where somewhere between 10 and 20% more water fell out of the sky because of climate change. And that is because, of course, we have, warmer oceans, and that's pulling more moisture up into the atmosphere, which then, when it comes down again, means there's more water coming down. Fairly sort of straightforward. And if you think about that, 10 to 20% doesn't sound all that bad. That's not as bad as 50% or 60% or 80%. But it's the peak of the rain that causes the peak of the flooding and therefore the peak of the damage. The first few centimetres of rain you can deal with. That's no particular problem. It's just sort of... our storm drains and so on kind of deal with that. But the last couple of centimetres constitutes a biblical flood, right? That's the difference, is it's the very, very last amount of rain that actually constitutes the vast majority of the damage. And, one of the houses that I visited in Auckland a couple of weeks ago before Gabrielle had... rainwater lapping up over the awnings of the first floor. So, in other words, the water was 2 metres deep in the area where they lived. The family were forced up from the ground floor because it had filled with water into the upstairs. They didn't know whether that was going to be the end of it, and so they had to break out of a second floor window because they had child safety locks on it, which meant that they had to crowbar open the window, and it's lucky that they had something upstairs that they could crowbar it open with, and then actually jump into these roiling waters to escape. And they all got away with their lives. And those stories are replicated all over Auckland at the moment. Now, that house had flooded 3 times previously in the last couple of years, but it hadn't flooded anywhere like that. It had flooded up to sort of knee-deep a couple of times, and the family initially thought, it's another one of those, until it wasn't, at which point it was a little late to get out without having to exit through the top story. So this this is the age of consequences that we're living in. And the argument is being made that because we have, as a planet, utterly failed to cut our emissions and have increased global temperatures by about 1.1 degrees, roughly above pre-industrial levels, that we should it is too late, and we should therefore give up and just kind of move all of our efforts into adaptation. And I would have some sympathy for that if this wasn't a cumulative problem. But this is the consequence at 1.1 degrees. We're pretty sure that we will pass the threshold of 1.5 degrees in the next few years, and every tenth of a degree makes things considerably worse. And so we absolutely need to cut our emissions, and not only that, we need to take out a great deal of the carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane that we've put up into the atmosphere over preceding years, because it is the parts per million in the concentration in the atmosphere that makes the difference. And around the industrial era, there were about 260 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, and now there's 420. So we're literally changing the chemical composition of the atmosphere and pretending that it doesn't have any consequences. So that is got to be our first order of business, is to stop putting that up in pollution into the atmosphere that causes climate change in the first place, and remove a great deal of what is already up there. Now, the corollary of all of this, of course, is that it wasn't New Zealand by itself that caused 1.1 degree of global warming. We were one of the countries that did that and are continuing to do that, but everybody else is part of this as well. So one of the things that I continuously hear as well, New Zealand constitutes less than 1% of global emissions. We're too small to make a difference. And if anybody challenges you with that, and you hear it a lot, point out to them that New Zealand has the same population as Los Angeles. It's about 5 million people. And if we don't do anything about climate change, then actually Los Angeles doesn't need to do anything about climate change. And of course, if Los Angeles doesn't need to do anything about climate change, neither does New York or Chicago or San Antonio. In other words, the United States of America. And so, the thing is that we all have a role to play, and we all have to play that part. The other part of that, of course, is that we do have the 6th highest emissions per capita in the world on a consumption basis, certainly. And so, as a wealthier, high-emitting nation, we actually have more of an effort, more of a role to play than many others. The second thing that I wanted to second theme I wanted to just cover is some of what I have heard about internationally, and particularly in terms of what's going on with agriculture. There is a bit of a myth that's kind of quite popular in certain parts of talkback radio and various rural media, which is that Paris says that agriculture doesn't need to do anything because it produces food. This is, of course, completely incorrect. We do know that we need to maintain food security, and that we have a growing global population, and that the amount of arable land around the world is continuing to shrink as a result of our somewhat catastrophic practices. So therefore, in aggregate, the world needs to be producing more food, not less. But it is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It does mean that we actually have to reduce our emissions from agriculture alongside every other sector in the world, but to do so at a time when we're increasing food security. And that has to be the single greatest driver of innovation, research and development that you can possibly imagine, because that's quite a task, and that is what we're here to do. The Paris Agreement does specifically task us with the job of ensuring that we're avoiding hunger, famine, food insecurity, and so on, whilst we go about our efforts of dealing with climate change, whether that's reducing emissions or adapting to the effects of climate change. And of course, we've seen the impact on food production in the Hawke's Bay as a result of the impacts of climate change over the course of the last week. So we have to be mindful of our production and make sure that we are actually doing that. But the other thing that we need to do is to make sure that we're focused on food security, hunger, and famine, which is distinct, I think, from a distinct argument, although it's related to profit. The other thing is that other countries are starting to do things, because one of the things I hear obviously is, we're doing everything and no one else is doing anything. The Netherlands, Ireland, Canada, and others are starting to move quite aggressively in relation to agricultural emissions, particularly, well, in the Netherlands it's more focused on nitrous oxide, but in other countries it's methane as well. Although they don't draw the distinction that we do between fossil methane and agricultural methane. So we're just watching some of those developments, and some of the policy tools that they're using are particularly blunt instruments, which we don't have a great deal of enthusiasm for. So we're coming up with something considerably less blunt and way more complex. Good for us. Okay. Speaking of which, the next bit is about, so what's New Zealand's role in all of this? We've obviously had the Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Alliance and other instruments for a number of years now, and have invested, at least from the Crown side, something on the order of $200 to $300 million in R&D, and that's sort of starting to produce some good results in both here in New Zealand and around the world. Of course, last year we put aside $340 million for a new centre for action on agricultural greenhouse gases, and we referred to it as a centre for action because we need to be relentlessly focusing on execution, not just on more research and development. Right? Which is why we wanted a new and distinct organisation that wasn't just doing R&D, because we already have those. And we didn't want to create duplication. And so if you hear about any duplication, please let me know, because the intention here is actually to start changing our practices, not just doing the pure research piece. And so that's, obviously, cumulatively, that's $500 million of investment from the Crown side, and we're hoping that will actually start to make a significant difference. So we are now living clearly in the time of consequences, and as I said, we do need to feed more people around the world with less arable land and more instability than we have before, and that means significant change here in Aotearoa and around the world. And it does mean that New Zealand's agricultural sector and our research institutes really do have a very significant role to play. So let's get cracking. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, James. I'm going to have to share your microphone so they can hear me. Thank you very much. Now, I still haven't seen my app light up, so are there any hands going up in the audience? Are there any queries to date? James, I have one, and I'm taken back to something you may have looked at in your graduate studies, and that was the Stern report that came out in 2006. Which said at that time that I think it would cost 1% of global GDP to fix things then, but it was going to get more expensive the more we delayed. And guess what? We've delayed. Have you seen anything recent on what that cost would be?
Well, actually, I should ask Rod Carr that. So one of the, so I know that Nick Stern and others have been updating that report and have been doing more work in terms of the global economy. When the Climate Change Commission provided us with their report in Aiatonu Nei, which formed the basis of our emissions budgets and our emissions reduction plan, one thing that they did do was, what does that modelling look like for New Zealand? And there have been various versions of that in history, so that was kind of updated. But they did something that had not been done anywhere before, which is they looked at the counterfactual, which is that if we don't do this, what does that look like? And so, Rod, what were the numbers? I think it was about 1% if we do something and about 2% if we don't. Yeah, so twice as expensive to not act than it is to act.
All right.
Yeah.
And we're approaching that position, I guess. How are we doing for hands? Do I see any hands around the room? You're either all in agreement or dumbstruck.
Or just haven't had your first coffee.
Oh, Harry.
Oh, man, Harry.
I was just, last year there was the global methane pledge that 104 countries pledged to reduce emissions by 30% collectively. And I just wondered where you saw that, New Zealand's role in that, given that our targets are somewhat, our national targets are somewhat less than that. And secondly, how do you see the role of international collaboration in the research field to try and bring solutions to the table much quicker? And I'm thinking in particular, New Zealand's involvement in the Global Research Alliance, and how do you see New Zealand's continuing support for that involvement? Okay, how long do I have? Okay, so on the first part of your question, Harry, as I said, most other countries don't distinguish between fossil methane and biogenic methane the way that we do. And the 30% target was an all-you-can-eat methane target. And many of the countries that we were kind of pushing to sign up are ones for whom actually the balance is a great deal more fossil methane than biogenic methane. Our fossil methane target is 0. And I don't think that we should forget that. It's just that we produce very little fossil methane because we have such a tiny oil and gas sector compared to some of the other countries around the world. So we signed up on the basis that it's a global target of 30%, on the basis that our orientation is that you have to focus primarily or first on fossil methane because there are different characteristics in terms of the biological cycle than biogenic methane. But also I do hope that it is something of a rod for our own backs to say, well, actually, we actually do understand that concentrations of methane in the atmosphere do make a difference, whether they're from fossil sources or from biological sources, because CH4 is CH4. And it does have a dramatically greater effect on global warming when it's in the atmosphere than CO2 does. So that's that. And the second part of your question, I think there's two parts to it. One is around, what are we doing domestically versus what are we doing internationally? And we know, because we've got research that demonstrate this over and over again, that focusing on on-farm profit rather than merely production levels can actually lead to both an increase in profitability for the farm itself, to its operating profit, and also to a reduction in greenhouse gases. And that's largely because when you have in some place, it obviously depends on the farm, but there are places where you could reduce stock by about 10 to 15%, reduce the input costs significantly in terms of additional feed or fertiliser, which happens to have the impact of reducing emissions, but actually it also has the impact of increasing farm profitability. And that's not a particularly whiz-bang scientific invention, that's just a business model. And it doesn't require any new science, and we could have been doing that for quite some time, but we haven't because we're obsessed with production levels, more than we are with profit. And so if I was looking for a place to start domestically, that's where I'd start. Let's try and start making some money. And coincidentally, that'll reduce our emissions by about the amount that we have set as our target. But internationally, because our kind of model is very different and significantly more productive than many other systems around the world, we can make a real difference in improving the productivity of farming systems in other countries, which in those systems would also have the impact of reducing emissions. And that is obviously where the Global Research Alliance is seeking to make a difference. I have yet to know whether it does, though, because I get lots of reports that say what our inputs are, but I have no idea what our outcomes are. Something we're particularly bad at public policy in New Zealand is that we focus very much on what we spend and what we put in, but we have no idea what we get out.
Harry, I can't believe that you've controlled access so well to this conference that we don't have any climate activists around who want to ask James something. Are there any other hands? Yeah, good man, sir.
Thanks, James. John Sunkel from down in Canterbury, as a dairy farmer and Environment Canterbury. What's your view of, I guess, the international marketplace and putting on the pressures to make change as opposed to government regulation? And I'm still not clear in my mind, is our methane reduction 20%, 30 or 50, or is it the 20 or 30% that maybe the market is going to demand of us? So where do you see the real tensions and reductions policy here or the market driving?
Look, that's a really good question, and I actually I think that they can and should go hand in hand. So we know, for example, that some of the really big global food companies that we sell to, like Danone, or some of the big supermarket chains in the UK like Sainsbury's and Tesco's and so on, are starting to put in increasingly hard word on our producers about the emissions intensity in our products, and so you can actually see, Fonterra and Silverfern Farms and others starting to kind of work quite hard to respond to that, because they're worried about market access rather than they are worried about domestic policy. However, when you have when you have collective action in this country, it does mean that we are able to go to the market and to say, actually, as a country, we are reducing our emissions, regardless of who the particular kind of producer is in this case. And if it's got that sort of stamp of approval, if you like, that can make a real difference in terms of offshore access. I'll give you an example which may not resonate with you, but it's one I know reasonably well, which is, we've got a couple of different standards for organic production here, which are voluntary standards, which are very well accepted and have been used in the industry for donkey's years, decades actually. But we also know that overseas, when there is a kind of a national standard for organics, that actually that sector has expanded its exports by up to 4 times in different countries. And so that was one of the reasons why we were pushing quite hard, or why we are pushing quite hard, because it hasn't quite made it all the way through Parliament, the New Zealand Organic Products Bill, because that will produce a sort of a nationwide standard for us to say, well, actually this has got that sort of official stamp on it. And what I hope then is that sector will then see a similar growth in its export value, because it becomes that kind of market signal that would help there. So I do think that the two can go hand in hand, but we obviously have to get that right.
And down in the front row, second row here.
Thank you, Suzanne Rowe, AgResearch. The emissions that come from livestock, or obviously from what they eat, one of the technologies that is available to us, or could be available to us, is the gene editing of crops and grasses in order to help fight the system then. What's the appetite in New Zealand for actually enabling some of these technologies? Because they're being enabled globally, but our hands seem to be tied at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things first of all, that's covered under the HASNO Act, which David Parker, as Environment Minister, is responsible for. So I don't have a lot to do with it. But when I have been asked this question before, where I generally go is kind of consumer acceptability is not quite the same thing as scientific safety, if you like. So, there's a kind of a revolving door of scientists who tell me, for example, that gene editing has obviously moved, like the science has moved a great long way since Monsanto were doing really nutty things back in the 90s, and that from a kind of scientific point of view, there are far fewer concerns than there would have been 10 or 20 years ago. However, the kind of impact that the adoption of that technology has on kind of brand New Zealand, onto the value of our exports, onto a kind of consumer acceptability is a distinct question. And I think that to this other point comes back to what are we hearing internationally? Now, I can find you, in California, of course, a bottled water company that sells GE-free water. This is clearly not a scientific matter, but that sort of gives you a sense of where consumers are at. So I just think if we're going to go down that route, then we need to kind of step it apart very carefully to say, well, yes, there's a scientific question that we just need to be sure about, that's fine, but there's also kind of like brand New Zealand and consumer acceptability thing. There's also a great deal of suspicion about corporate control of IP, and I think Monsanto, who I mentioned before, obviously spoiled things for everybody in that regard through their sort of somewhat rapacious approach back in the 90s in particular. And we just need to be clear about what it is that we're talking about and make sure that we've got all of our bases covered before we do that, because there are other risks outside of the scientific domain that we need to manage.
And 2/3 of the way back, up here. Coming your way shortly.
Thank you for everything so far. And you are the one minister sort of taking what Steve suggested as an example we might want to think about, which is activists. You've been punched in the face on the way to work. And we've seen a lot of activism or disinformation, misinformation, really bad stuff from probably the far right. But increasingly, we're also seeing the left and activism, including wings of the Green Party, that are against the agenda that you've tried to support through climate finance, through action on climate change that's supported by government. I'm really worried about doomism. Troy Baisden, co-president of the New Zealand Association of Scientists. I'm worried about doomism and misinformation and disinformation creeping up all the way across politics and driving a wedge between agriculture and progress. What do you think about that, and what should we do?
It's a good question, Troy. I think the people inside the Green Party who have been having a go at me haven't been having a go at me because of what I was doing, but because I wasn't doing enough of it. Which my point to them was, well, I'm not the one who's dragging the chain here. I am also deeply worried about misinformation, disinformation, and about the bifurcation of people's reality that's been driven through kind of social media in particular. One of the things that was particularly disturbing when we had the riots outside Parliament just over a year ago on the lawn there's some quite good research that shows where New Zealanders were getting their information about that event. And there was about 60% of the population who were getting their information through mainstream media, so they might have been watching the TV or listening to the radio, or if they were on the internet, they were looking at, stuff, NZ Herald, the RNZ app, newsroom, so on. There was about 40% of the population that were getting their information primarily from YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, TikTok. And the thing that really disturbs me is that there was almost no crossover between those two groups. So in other words, 60% of the population were getting pretty much all of their information through mainstream media, and 40% were getting pretty much all of their information, and I use the word information advisedly, through social media. And so that is an incredibly dangerous trend where people are literally seeing reality in quite different ways because of the source of their information. And that, I think, is dangerous for our democracy. I know that there are policies that the government would put in place, but we know that there is a group of people who will kick off and make it politically impossible for us to do that because of that kind of bifurcated reality. And that essentially means that the country could become ungovernable. So, you might call me a doomist now, but I'm not feeling particularly kind of optimistic about the direction of travel there.
Okay, James, we should probably let you go at that stage.
On that happy note.
James has got an incredibly busy day today. James, you've been speaking to an audience that collectively spends several hundred years looking at these problems, I think, of agriculture, greenhouse gases and their interaction. But what you've been able to bring to us is the over picture, the overview, which we can't individually put together. So we're grateful to you for doing that. So would you kindly join me in thanking James for speaking to us this morning? Right, Andy, would you like to join me on stage here so that we can move forward? It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, who is well known to, I think, pretty well all of you here. That's Andy Reisinger. In fact, to welcome him back